Hello. Who are you? Doesn't matter. Welcome. You're safe with me. I'll be right here, nice and close so I can speak without alerting the others.
So I've never really issued a content warning at the beginning of a review. For the most part, with Tomb Raider being maybe the only exception, I tend to sanitize the games that need it of anything potentially disturbing while editing. But this time is probably a little different. In this video, I will be talking about some unpleasant stuff. In this video, you will see some pretty disturbing images. Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice is not a game that can easily be sanitized, because any sterilizing effort will remove the essence of what this game is. At its core, this game is a journey deep into some of the psychological horrors that can destroy a human mind. That is different than a psychological horror game like Resident Evil 7, though there are thematic elements that will seem familiar to horror aficionados. Hellblade starts off with a warning that people who have experienced psychosis should maybe not be playing. That's not an encouraging place to start. The first 20 minutes or so are not really a game. It's expositional and gives you a chance to slowly break into mechanics. You are introduced to the characters and story, the puzzle solving, and then combat. Up to this point, I thought the game was atmospheric and creepy. It was pretty to look at, and the environment did a really good job of selling a specific emotional state. I was uneasy, but more interested than anything else. My first impression of the combat was that it was probably going to scale pretty nicely with my skill level, and I wouldn't have much trouble staying alive. But this first fight isn't one you can win. Much like Bloodborne, you are intended to lose the first fight. Unlike Bloodborne, I don't think there's any way around that, and that's because the game wants you to see Senua die. This is within the first 20 minutes of the game. Fair warning, you might not want to watch this part.
A vision of what's to come. Poor Senua. The darkness does not bargain. It does not reason. It is rot. And now it has taken hold.
Now, I have played some pretty graphic games. The free weekend for 2016's Doom, for instance, was incredibly graphic. I've also seen my player character die in some pretty horrible ways. My personal pick for most cringeworthy up to this point was from Tomb Raider, when Lara Croft is slaloming down a river and you fail to dodge a pile of stakes. But nothing I have ever seen even comes close to comparing with that moment from Hellblade. I think the main reason for that is because just moments before that death, Senua turns around and she sees you. She looks right at the screen, and instead of talking to an audience, like happens in some games, she's talking to the darkness inside her own mind, while looking right at you. That moment was unsettling, but then the darkness kills her, and I couldn't shake the sense that it was somehow my fault. In Hellblade, I do not feel like the protagonist of the story. The player is not Senua, but rather one of the voices in her head, silent but somehow still controlling, witnessing, participating in, even inciting the agony that she experiences. It was one of the most narratively powerful moments I've ever seen. That statement isn't limited to video games, movies, books, whatever. Senua's death struck me like nothing else ever has, full stop. And that was the beginning of what I can only describe as a remarkably harrowing experience. I have never felt anything like the psychosis this game tries to depict, but if this game is accurate, I have gained an enormous respect for those who have, and still managed to push on regardless. As a character, Senua is probably the video game protagonist I respect the most out of anyone I've seen. Not because she's bad, though she is, and not because she's relatable or likable, though she is both of those as well. No, I respect Senua because I feel like she has persevered through much more difficult challenges than any other game protagonist out there. There was a moment, as I was approaching the first boss fight I had in the game, when Senua shouted to the voices in her head,
"My gods abandoned me! I am alone."
And that hammered home some of the struggles I could see Senua having. She was surrounded by voices, constantly, vocalizing her shortcomings and questioning every decision as if a chorus of detractors had been set on her shoulders. Again, I couldn't help but think that I was among those voices, controlling Senua's actions, meaning that beyond discouragement, the voices also robbed her of control. And then there's that darkness, a game presence that represents Senua's past traumas simply trying to tear her mind apart. All of this antagonism and helplessness just in her head, where she feels as if she's facing it alone. That sense of being alone hit me almost as hard as the death from earlier. As Senua stood there facing the prospect of her own very personal hell, the only thing that I could think was, no, you're not alone. I was there. I was hopefully clear-headed. I was committed to getting her through this. And that is, without question, the greatest sense of immersion I've ever felt in a game. No VR, no massive open world, an intensely intimate story that managed to put me directly in a character's head. I am invested in Senua's future, in her salvation. A little later on in the game, Senua looks directly at you and says,
"I need this sword. It's important. Can you help me?"
My typical response to stuff like that within a game is usually, "Pfft, hey game developers, stop trying so hard." But when Senua asked that question, I actually, physically, nodded my head. I responded literally, unconsciously, and with zero sarcasm, to a video game character on my computer screen. With Hellblade, developer Ninja Theory has managed to get me more invested in a work of fiction than anyone else before, and I consider that the primary reason why this game will go down in history as a classic of visual storytelling. It is, of course, also a game, so let's talk for a minute about the technical aspect of what's going on here. First off, and I don't think there's really any disputing this, Hellblade is a visual masterpiece. To think that an indie development team that never rose above 15 core members managed to produce a game that looks as real and beautiful as Hellblade does absolutely blows my mind. If you're interested in the tech behind the game, go over to Ninja Theory's channel and check out their dev diaries from Hellblade's development. There was a lot of invention and innovation involved with, for example, the motion capture for the game, in order to make something high quality but also within their indie title budget constraints. The other technical marvel of this game is the sound design. And not to put too fine a point on it, if you aren't playing this game while wearing headphones, you're playing it wrong.
He's there, you know. There's no doubt about it. The source of the darkness is in Helheim. And the goddess Hela holds his soul there.
The music is excellent, and the environmental sounds are also excellent, but it's the voice acting and sounds of Senua's psychosis that really blow you off your feet. Everything was recorded binaurally, meaning that the microphones they used to record it did so in basically the exact same way your ears do. When it's played back through headphones, you get an amazing 3D sound experience that makes you feel like you're really there with the voices. It's eerie, it's unsettling, and it's incredibly effective.
Why is she doing this? They're watching. Why doesn't she turn coming? She's doing this for him. She wants to rescue him.
He's already there. I can feel you coming. Quiet. Oh, how rude of me. I never told you of the others. You hear them too, right?
Then, of course, we come down to the actual gameplay mechanics. You might see some reviews of the game claiming that because the focus is on the story and character of Senua instead of the gameplay, that Hellblade isn't actually a game. Those reviews come from the people who get swindled out of $250 every year via EA's repackaged sports franchises, and probably thought the story of BioShock detracted from the gunplay. It's safe to say you can probably ignore those people. Hellblade's gameplay is focused around puzzle solving and melee combat, one of which it does really well, and the other a little less so. Puzzles in Hellblade serve the same sort of function as they might in other games, though instead of being focused on pickups or collectibles, they're focused around Senua's perception of the world around her. You'll be lining things up and focusing on them to reveal new parts of the map or open up paths and doors that were previously closed. It's a unique take on some fairly standard puzzle gameplay, and it works well in the context of the game. Part of Senua's psychosis is that she sees things that others wouldn't, finding patterns where there maybe shouldn't be. Because the puzzles are so unique and intricately tied in with the game, I actually found them to be among the most enjoyable moments of gameplay. They were challenging without being frustrating, and the solutions were always satisfying. Melee combat is probably the weakest aspect of Hellblade, but I think I understand why it worked out that way. At the beginning of the game, when you're just figuring out how the combat really works, it's entertaining enough, but it doesn't take long before it starts to feel pretty repetitive. There really aren't too many available combinations of attacks, and once you've found one that works for you, you pretty much just rinse and repeat for most of the rest of the game. My favorite combo was dodge, fast, 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 dodge, heavy, with a shield break in there assuming I was fighting one of the guys with shields. Aside from the 3 bosses in the game, who required a little adaptation, that was all I really needed. The upside of that is that button mashers such as myself will probably be able to finish the game without too much trouble. The downside is that you start dreading the combat sections. Of course, that really only applies to the middle section of the game, after you've learned the combat but before the combat really ramps up. The enemies don't change, but Hellblade will start throwing them at you in larger groups, and then you'll start to dread the combat for a different reason. See, if you die too many times in Hellblade, your save file gets erased and you have to start over. So you'll work on speeding up how quickly you can deal with one enemy and move on to the next, because this isn't Assassin's Creed. The guy standing behind you won't hesitate to shank you in the back. That's when the voices sitting with you inside of Senua's head become useful, shouting warnings at you, providing access to Senua's finely tuned warrior's senses. As the numbers increase, the fighting becomes a frantic dance of evasion, blocking, and desperate hacking, interspersed with moments of focus that show you what Senua is really capable of. But here's the rub. Anyone focused on those mechanics has missed the point of the game, which is Senua herself. Are the levels somewhat linear, the combat a little tedious, and the permadeath stressful? Sure. The levels are linear because Senua is feeling fatalistic. She cannot see another path for her own story, and so you're locked into that fate with her. The combat is basic because Senua is weary. She's a warrior, that much is clear, but she's been fighting her own past for so long that everything about the battle is agonizing, wearying repetition that becomes more desperate as the journey wears on. And the game won't give you an infinite number of chances because, and do we really need to spell this out, Senua is actively losing her mind. Every time she suffers a defeat, it breaks her a little more until eventually there's nothing left but madness. Every mechanic, every environment, every word spoken, and every expression on Senua's incredibly well-rendered face serves as an extension of the story. Some will claim that the game isn't actually a game, and frankly, they're wrong. There are objectives, there is interactivity, and as opposed to being an outside observer, you are a participant. Those are the tenets of a game. But in a break with tradition for games that look and sound as good as this does, the focus of Hellblade is not on gameplay. It never was. The focus is on the story, on the character of Senua and her particular background and trials. It was never intended to be anything other than that. It isn't intended to be an excellent combat simulator, and that's fair considering most indie games are laser-focused at being about one thing. It also can't be an expansive treatise on mental health, because while mental illness is certainly one of Senua's key character traits, she is only one person. This game isn't about big topics or massive acceptance, it's about Senua. It's about putting you, literally you, directly in her head so you can experience her story with her as she struggles to deal with her grief. So stop trying to judge this game as a vessel of higher meaning, because the meaning in the game applies directly to Senua, and as I said earlier, the player is not Senua. So there it is. The game is harrowing, stressful, terrifying, and heart-wrenching. There is payoff at the end, but much like life, it's complex, and I wouldn't say it actually feels like a resolution. For what plagues Senua, there is no real resolution. But I will say the game is beautiful, the mechanics and environments are thoughtful, the performances are flawless, and if you really want immersion, this is the best I've ever seen. At $30, you are getting a AAA visual experience for indie game money, and a story with insights rarely even approached in either category. For anyone looking for a purely mechanical game, this probably isn't for you. But if you are looking for deep immersion and narrative depth, I cannot recommend this experience highly enough. They say to begin to understand someone, you must first walk 2 moons in their shoes. This game will change you, and that's not something many games can claim.